يا راغبا في كل علم نافع.
ينمو العلم ويتقدم بتقنياته ومجالاته، ومعه نطور أدواتنا في تقديم العلم الشرعي. أكاديمية
زاد أكاديمية ينبوعها صاف ليروي غلة الظمآن، ومكارم الأخلاق ندرسها معا، أدب وتربية على الإحسان. بشرى لنا زاد أكاديمية للعلم كالأزهار في البستان.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Inshallah ta'ala, in this part we'll talk about at-taqwa in Islamic education. Number 2, talking about the deeds done by the heart. We talked about al-ikhlas, sincerity, briefly. And another action done by the heart is at-taqwa. At-taqwa, as we will get to know the meaning of it, many people, they might translate it as the fear of Allah, to be modest, to be obedient to Allah, and it has all of these meanings, to purify oneself from sins. So at-taqwa is the real provisions in this life, that a person would seek in this life to be among the people of taqwa, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in many verses in the Quran that this is the thing to be upon for a person to enter the Jannah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to be saved from the hellfire. And when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talked about Hajj and how people in the journey of Hajj, they need to take provisions, nobody would travel without provisions. They're insane if they do so. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, after reminding the people, He said, وَتَزَوَّدُوا فَإِنَّ خَيْرَ الزَّادِ التَّقْوَى. Take provisions, but the best of all provisions is the taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَاتَّقُونِ يَا أُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. Fear me, shield yourself from my punishment, O people of reason. And this is the way, the criteria to know who's best and who's not. إِنَّ أَكْرَمَكُمْ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ أَتْقَاكُمْ. The best among you to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the most honored are those who have more fear of Allah, those who have more taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's basically the means of salvation, the ways for a person to attain the Jannah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to be saved from the hellfire. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned so many verses about it, and even called the people to help one another when it comes to matters of taqwa. وَتَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْبِرِّ وَالتَّقْوَى. Help one another on matters of righteousness and the taqwa, the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's an individual act and also people together to be doing it, and it comes from the heart. We're talking about deeds done by the heart. The Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, he pointed at his heart 3 times and he says, at-taqwa ha-huna, at-taqwa ha-huna, at-taqwa ha-huna. The taqwa is right here. The taqwa is right here, which is in the heart. So it's a deed done by the heart. The word at-taqwa comes from al-wiqaya, or something that means to be shielded, to be protected. So this is where it linguistically comes from. And when it comes to religiously, how it's defined, the famous definition of Talq ibn Habib, rahimahullah, when he talked and they asked him about at-taqwa. What is at-taqwa? And he was asked about this at times when there was fitan and tribulations. He says, أن تعمل بطاعة الله. And listen to this very carefully. That you would do the act of obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. على نور من الله. From light from Allah. That means clearly knowing that this is from Allah. This is from the Quran. This is from the Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. ترجو ثواب الله. You hope for the rewards from Allah. And on the other side, أن تترك معصية الله. From the taqwa, that you leave the disobedience of Allah. على نور من الله. Knowing that this is a ma'siyah. Knowing that this is a sinful act. And why is that? تخاف عقاب الله. That you fear the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So whatever you are, in whatever state that you're in, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded you to be doing something, then you need to be doing it. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbade you from something, don't be doing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbade you. And it doesn't matter what it is. Why? Because we need to know what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us. It's not something that you would get to know by common sense or by your whims or your desires, but rather wahi, revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So establishing the matters of the tawheed, establishing the salah, even friendship. which is many people, they don't make this as part of their religion. When the Prophet ﷺ, he clearly stated that al-mar'u ala dini khalilih falyanzur ahadukum man yukhalil. The person is according to his friend's religion. So let one of you look who is his best friend, who's his close friend. So this is a matter of religion here, something to do with the taqwa. The people of taqwa, their friends are also, they seek what appears to be the actions from the actions of the people of taqwa, and they run away from those who show the opposite of it. One of the famous things that is always narrated from the early generations of Islam, and it's narrated from more than one of which is Ubay ibn Ka'b radiallahu anhu, and Umar radiallahu anhu asked him about at-taqwa. He said to him, have you taken a path before that has shawk or thorns that is in this path? He says yes. So he said, how did you act as a result of that? He said, tashammartu wa hadirtu. I pulled my clothing up so for me to see where I'm putting my foot before I put it, and I would warn myself so that I don't hurt myself. He said, فَذَاكَ التَّقْوَى. This is how exactly what at-taqwa is. Before we speak, before we act, before we do anything, we need to make that decision. Is it a good thing or not? Is it something that would take us to the hellfire وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ, or to the Jannah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? So, and then if it's good, then a person will go for it. If it's bad, then a person stays away from it. And it's all with ilm, with matters of knowledge. And when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded the believers, and He said, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا اتَّقُوا اللَّهَ حَقَّ تُقَاتِهِ, have the taqwa of Allah the way it ought to be. And some said that to obey Him the way it ought to be. And as Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu, he said, أَنْ يُطَاعَ فَلَا يُعْصَى, that you obey Allah and you don't disobey Him, that you make remembrance of Allah, you don't become forgetful, and that you're grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and you're not ungrateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One thing that is always mentioned also is taqwa is something that people need to enjoin when it comes to their relationship towards one another. We have been commanded to be upon at-taqwa. We should command one another to be upon at-taqwa. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that this is the wasiyah, this is the bequest of the early and the later and everyone. وَلَقَدْ وَصَّيْنَا الَّذِينَ أُوتُوا الْكِتَابَ مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ وَإِيَّاكُمْ أَنِ اتَّقُوا اللَّهِ. That we have been admonished and requested and commanded and bequeathed the people of the book from before you and yourself, that you have the taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that you fear Allah, that you're obedient to Allah, that you purify yourself from the sins. So this is from every messenger. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded him to convey that to the people. This is to all messengers. This is all to all nations. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded them to be upon the taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there's one of the beautiful hadith of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, very comprehensive, that summarize for oneself the rights of Allah and the rights of the human beings. اتق الله حيثما كنت وأتبع السيئة الحسنة تمحها وخالق الناس بخلق حسن, which means fear Allah, be dutiful to Allah, have the taqwa of Allah wherever you are, and follow the bad deed with the good deed that would wipe it away, and deal with people, have manners with people with good manners. So the rights of Allah, the rights of the human being, and always the Prophet ﷺ and the early generations of Islam would always give this request to one another to be upon the taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You want to be among awliyaullah, the people that are the closest to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The way to achieve this is by the taqwa of Allah. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, أَلَا إِنَّ أَوْلِيَاءَ اللَّهِ لَخَوْفٌ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا هُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَكَانُوا يَتَّقُونَ. It is not a tricky thing. It's not something that is to be given by inheritance. It's not a certificate that a person would get by others, but rather, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, awliyaullah, the closest to Allah, the allies of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, those who are loyal to Allah, there's no fear for them, nor shall they grieve. Who are they? Those who believe, and they are among the people of taqwa. وَكَانُوا يَتَّقُونَ, and yattaqun in the present tense, that shows it's a continuous act from them, not once in a while. And in awliya'u illa al-muttaqun walakinna aktharahum la ya'lamun. The awliya of Allah are the muttaqun, are the people of taqwa. So how to attain the taqwa is with the good deeds. And it's not by innovating in the deen, it's not by having supernatural things happening, flying in the air, walking on the water, things of that nature, but rather to be obedient to Allah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect the people of taqwa. And the most important matters for them to be protected upon is to be obedient to Allah, to be steadfast upon the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why one of the ways to attain this wilayah and the closeness to Allah is to do the obligatory actions and to follow that with the recommended actions and to be continuously doing so till a person reaches that state where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala love him. And this famous hadith of al-wilayah, man aada li waliyan faqad adhantu bil harb. Whoever show enmity to any of my awliya, those close to me, I declare war against them. And then the hadith explains how to attain that high level of goodness. وَمَا تَقَرَّبَ إِلَيَّ عَبْدِي بِشَيْءٍ أَحَبَّ إِلَيَّ مِمَّا افْتَرَضْتُ عَلَيْهِ. My slave would never get closer to me by anything other than or more than what I had commanded him as a fard, as an obligation to be upon him. This is the most important thing. وَمَا يَزَالُ عَبْدِي يَتَقَرَّبُ إِلَيَّ بِالنَّوَافِلِ حَتَّى أُحِبَّ, till the end of the hadith. And my slave, the slave of Allah, will keep on getting himself closer to Allah with the nawafil, with the optional acts of worship, till Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala love him. So the consistency in the ibadah, the fard, and then followed with the recommended acts of worship, it shows that how the wilayah of Allah, the closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to be attained by following the deen of Allah and to have the taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Some of the things that when we talk about haram, we have to have sanctuary or a barrier between us and the haram. Sometimes people, is it haram? They say, is it haram? Is it haram? As if they're at ease to be close to what it's haram. We have to be away from haram. We have to have, if it's correct to say, a buffer zone between us and the haram. And this is a sign of taqwa. If something you know that this is would ruin you, you would stay away from it. And this is something that is mentioned in the ayat of the Quran, the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. Maybe also we can describe this in a later time, inshallah ta'ala, with regards to al-halal wal-haram. When it's clear and what's between them, the mushtabihat, the matters that are doubtful, and how to deal with it is to stay away from it. And that's why some of the early generations of Islam, they would leave some of what's permissible out of the fear of falling into the haram. But for the person to do so, he has to have ilm, knowledge, so that he does not forbid what Allah permitted or to permit what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbid. So this is, many different aspects to be discussed in this matter. And that's why when we talk about deeds done by the heart, a very important aspect that we have to understand, since this is ilm, it is not something that you get inspired by and then you act upon it. We have to learn it according to the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and then we act upon what we know, and this is how we attain all these types of goodness and matters and deeds done by the heart, and not to fall into extremism or ways there is innovation in the deen and the like of this. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us among those who are sincere and among the people of taqwa, and we'll continue inshallah ta'ala next time, starting with the levels of taqwa. What are the levels that a person can attain in matters of taqwa? So we'll do that inshallah ta'ala next time. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa barak ala Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
يا راغبا في كل علم نافع
ينمو العلم ويتقدم بتقنياته ومجالاته، ومعه نطور أدواتنا في تقديم العلم الشرعي. أكاديمية
زاد أكاديمية ينبوعها صاف ليروي غلة الظمآن، ومكارم الأخلاق ندرسها معا، أدب وتربية على الإحسان. بشرى لنا زاد أكاديمية للعلم كالأزهار في البستان.